You know how sometimes you need to make a split-second decision to change a plan, only to find out that your new decision just made things much worse? Well, now imagine that this is happening to you as you're about to land an aircraft in the middle of the night.
Too low, terrain, hold up.
Stay tuned. Being a cargo pilot is a challenging and often wonderful job. Now, I haven't had the luck of trying it out myself, but I have plenty of friends who have, and whilst most of them absolutely love it, there is no getting away from the fact that most cargo operations happens at night, and that comes with some real challenges. During the early 2010s, there had been a fierce debate in the United States about improvements of pilot flight time limitations, and in January 2012, new rules were actually published. Those provided more stringent limitations, specifically for pilots conducting passenger transport, but curiously, not for cargo pilots. The cargo airlines had successfully lobbied that these new rules would not be realistic for their type of mostly nocturnal operation, and instead pointed to their own fatigue management systems, which they had negotiated with their own unions. Now, even though the cargo airlines might have had a point there, this was obviously a source of great frustration among their pilots, which we will soon see here. But no matter how you turn it, the responsibility for turning up rested for a flight is and has always been shared between both the pilot, the airline and the regulator. And if any one of those doesn't do their part, well, then pilot fatigue can be the result, which is worth remembering for this story. I will get to the accident flight very soon, but before that, I want to have a look at the two pilots involved in this story and how they spent their days before this fateful flight. The captain was 58 years old and had been working for UPS for almost 23 years. He had started his career in the military, moved on to the regionals, and then finally to a flight engineer position on the Boeing 727 for Transworld. Now, he worked in that position for a while before he upgraded to first officer, and interestingly, we don't know exactly how much total time he had before joining UPS. But once he joined, he went back to being a flight engineer, before again upgrading to first officer on the Boeing 727. Now, according to internal UPS records, he then tried to upgrade to captain on the Boeing 757 twice in the year 2000, but ended up withdrawing voluntarily from both of those courses since he found them too overwhelming. Instead, in 2004, he changed over to the Airbus A300 fleet, where he continued flying in the right seat for several years before finally upgrading to captain in 2009. His total flying experience in UPS was around 6,400 hours, of which 3,265 had been flown on the Airbus A300. Now, another thing that's worth pointing out about the captain was that he had received poor grades on a few occasions on his recurrent training sessions, specifically around his knowledge and execution of non-precision approaches. He had, for example, on a few occasions flown below the minimum descent altitude, among other things. But that had happened during training sessions, where the objective was to train to proficiency, so it had never caused any actual failed check rides. He was well liked by his colleagues, who described him as a diligent, nice and competent pilot open to taking inputs from his colleagues. But during the month before this flight, he had begun to complain about the roster, saying that it was getting harder and harder with more and more legs having to be flown, and that he doubted that he would have the energy to continue flying like that until he retired. During the days before the accident flight, the captain had, according to his wife, been sleeping normally and had, before he started his duty, tried to take regular naps in order to change his body rhythm over from day to night shift. During the evening before the accident flight, his wife had dropped him off at the UPS facility in Charlotte, North Carolina, where he had then flown as a passive crew member over to Louisville. Once he arrived there, he booked a sleep room at the UPS crew facilities and napped for a few hours before the shift started, which means that he was likely reasonably well rested and without any huge sleep debt at that point. The first officer was 37 years old and had been flying for both corporate and regional operators before she was hired by UPS as a 727 flight engineer back in 2006. She quickly moved over to the 757 fleet, where she upgraded to first officer, and she then transitioned over to the 747, on which she stayed for a few years. Then in 2012, she was again moved over to the Airbus A300, where she had been operating ever since. Her total time was just over 4,700 hours, and out of those, she had only flown around 400 hours on the Airbus at the time of this flight. Her training records were clean and she was described as a top-notch person with good flying skills, and her captains liked flying with her. But she had recently also started complaining about the roster and how she barely could keep her eyes open in flight sometimes. On one occasion in March 2013, a colleague had actually found her sitting with her face down on a table in the crew room, complaining about being totally and completely exhausted. Before the accident flight, she had started her shift flying one night flight before having a further long break. She then used that break by going visiting a friend in Houston before, on the following day, going back on a jump seat flight to San Antonio and resuming her duty. That duty included flying over from San Antonio to Louisville in the late evening of the 12th of August, where she would be crewed together with the captain of this story. Now, even though she had mentioned to her husband that she had been sleeping a lot when she was visiting her friend, her use of personal electronic equipment showed that she really hadn't gotten that much coherent sleep there, and that pattern continued throughout the following day and night as well. So this meant that it is likely that the first officer had a substantial sleep debt when her shift with the accident captain started on the 13th of August, the day before the accident. The two pilots met up in the UPS crew room in Louisville around 02:30 in the morning and started preparing their flights together. Everything looked fine, so they eventually just walked out the aircraft, prepared it for departure, and then took off for their first flight over to General Downing, Peoria, and then their second to Chicago Rockford, where they had their scheduled night stop. These flights were completely uneventful, and they ended up signing into their hotel rooms at around 06:30 in the morning. But already at around 10:45, only 4 hours later, the first officer was seen having breakfast in the hotel restaurant, and she then was active on and off during the day until it was time to sign in for their next duty. It is likely that she had a few naps during the day, but not enough to cancel out that sleep debt that she was now undoubtedly carrying with her. The captain, on the other hand, seemed to have rested properly during the night stop, so he was in a quite good mood as the hotel shuttle brought them out to the airport at around 10 minutes past 8 in the evening. The duty that they had ahead of them was what's known as a split duty, where they would be operating 2 flights in the late evening, followed by a few hours of rest and then another flight in the very early morning. They again started by going through the planning documents which their dispatcher had prepared for them and saw that there would be no major issues during at least their first 2 flights. They decided on fuel to take, and then they walked out of the aircraft and started it up as normal, having no idea what was soon about to happen. And I'll tell you all about that after this. I have spent weeks researching everything I could about this accident, and that work would have been so much harder if it wasn't for today's sponsor, NordVPN. My whole team and I use NordVPN a lot, both from its VPN function that helps us bypass irritating geo-restrictions and to find better prices on everything from rental cars to flights and hotels. But also lately because of their great cybersecurity tools. You see, Nord has turned into a veritable shield against annoying ads, pesky malware and potential cyber attacks, keeping your online experience smooth, worry-free and really fast. I think we all know that there are just so many ways to make mistakes in today's hyper-connected world, so for me it feels great to have a tool like NordVPN by my side. But don't take my word for it. Check them out yourself using the link here below, which is nordvpn.com/pilot. This will give you 4 free months of the 2-year plan, and remember, you can test it risk-free for up to 30 days, and then you get a full refund if they don't meet your expectations. Thank you, Nord, and now let's continue. Before they started, they had decided that the captain would be pilot flying for the first flight from Rockford over to Peoria, and then the first officer was going to fly the second from Peoria over to Louisville. Both flights went off without any problems, and when they finally landed in Louisville around midnight, they saw that they would have an almost 3-hour-long break until it was time for their last flight over to Birmingham-Shuttlesworth Airport. This was plenty of time to get some shut-eye, so both pilots booked a sleep room at the UPS facilities to try to get the most out of the break. Now at this point, you might be wondering what the routines actually were at UPS for avoiding fatigue. I've already mentioned that cargo airlines had been exempted from the coming rule changes regarding crew flight time limitations, but that didn't mean that there weren't any rules in place. In fact, UPS had negotiated with the unions rules that were supposed to mitigate the threat of fatigue, and those rules were significantly stricter than the minimum required at the time. One super important part of those rules was the pilot's ability to call in fatigued whenever they felt that it was needed, and in that case being taken off the roster immediately with no questions asked. This facility was available for all pilots, but there were some strings attached to it. You see, UPS had put in force something known as a sick bank, where a certain amount of days were available for each pilot every year. A bonus on top of their regular pay would then be paid out at the end of the year based on the amount of days that were still left in that bank. If a pilot called in fatigued, this would then be investigated by a dedicated manager, and if it was found that the call was made unfairly, as in if the pilot had actually had enough rest to avoid fatigue but hadn't used it properly, well then a day would be removed from that pilot's sick bank. This was supposed to work as a positive incentive for the pilots, but anyone who knows humans knows how quickly something like that will start to be seen as a punishment instead, and how people will try to avoid losing out on that bonus in whatever way they could. At around 02:45 on the 14th of August, the two pilots came out of their sleep rooms and started preparing for their final flight. Both of them had managed to get a bit of sleep, and they now started looking through the briefing material that their flight dispatcher had once again prepared for them. On the weather side, it showed a weak front that was present just north of the Birmingham area with a low pressure gradient, meaning that they could expect very light winds but also some quite low clouds at around 400 feet. The low clouds were clearing slowly from the south, so at the time the pilots were looking at the observations, the cloud ceiling was variable between 600 and 1100 feet. On top of this, there was also an active Notice to Airmen, NOTAM, which indicated that the main runway at their destination airport, runway 0624, would be closed for some work on the runway lights between 0400 and 0500. Now their flight was scheduled to arrive about 10 minutes before the runway would be reopened again, so this left only runway 18 available for landing. This runway was significantly shorter than the main one, 7,099 feet instead of 11,998, and it also didn't have an ILS precision approach available to it. Instead, there was a localizer and an RNAV GPS non-precision approach available, and with the clouds as low as they were now indicating, this would require an extra alternate to be filed, since it was a high likelihood that the pilots wouldn't be able to see the runway from the higher minimas of those approaches. The dispatcher, who had been planning this flight, was well aware of this and had therefore planned for runway 18 to be used, but he didn't reach out to the crew directly to communicate this slightly unusual circumstance. He felt that it was up to the pilots to reach out to him if they had any questions, and he didn't want to reach out and possibly insult the captain with information that he thought would be obvious. At the time, the dispatchers in the US went through annual recurrent training to keep their planning skills high, and also something known as DRM, Dispatchers Resource Management, but that training never included any pilots. If that would have been the case, the dispatcher would have probably known that we pilots always appreciate any help that we can get, and no operational information would be seen as improper or insulting. And in fact, on this occasion, it looks like the pilots indeed missed that NOTAM about the closed runway, as some later discussions in the cockpit will soon show. And the fact that this whole thing could have likely been avoided if the flight was just operationally delayed by about 15 minutes or so to allow the main runway to open is just truly tragic. In any case, the pilots now finished up their preparation and then ordered the fuel for the short 45-minute hop down towards Birmingham. Since the first officer had flown the previous flight, the captain would now be flying, so as soon as they got out of the aircraft, he started setting it up for departure, whilst the first officer did a walk around and checked on the cargo loading. The aircraft they were operating was a 10-year-old Airbus A300, powered by two enormous Pratt & Whitney 4158 turbofan engines, and it was in great condition. The pilots had asked for 34,650 pounds of fuel, and with a cargo of 89,227 pounds, it would mean that they would be landing only 17,000 pounds below the max landing weight, meaning that they were quite heavy this morning. When the first officer came back into the cockpit, the captain gave her a departure briefing and then finished up the last part of the pre-flight preparation and checklist. They then had to wait a little bit for the final cargo loading to be completed, and during that time they chatted a bit about how they were feeling. The first officer mentioned that she had been feeling so tired when the alarm went off, and they then continued discussing the unfairness of the fact that they, cargo pilots, would not be included in the new flight time limitations that were being negotiated, like if they were second-class pilots or something. Now, I want to clearly point out here that these new rules for passenger-carrying pilots was not yet in force at this point, and even if they had been, these pilots would have still been legal to fly, even if they had been subjected to those new rules. The captain had only had a slightly shorter rest than required under the new rules a few months earlier, and the first officer was well within these new limits. Anyway, they soon received the last pieces of paperwork, and at time 03:55, flight 1354 requested pushback from the gate and started moving towards their departure runway 35 right. During the taxi out, the discussions in the cockpit were professional and to the point, and at time 0402, the captain advanced the thrust levers in the cockpit and the giant airbar started accelerating down the runway. The takeoff was completely normal, and they initially climbed straight ahead toward 5,000 feet according to their departure clearance. They retracted the flaps and slats on schedule and was soon headed over to the departure frequency, where the controller cleared them to climb to 10,000 feet and to turn onto an easterly radar heading before finally clearing them south down towards a VOR called Bowling Green. The first officer entered that VOR into the flight management computer and called out "Nav available," and the captain engaged the nav mode. Now this mode, the nav mode, will play an important role in what's soon about to happen. You see, modern aircraft generally follow a predetermined flight plan that have been approved by air traffic control long before the flight actually starts. A part of pilot flying's pre-flight preparation is to enter this flight plan into the flight management computer, and after that, verify it carefully and then execute it so it can be used in flight. When air traffic control then after departure clears the aircraft to a specific point, in this case the Bowling Green VOR, the pilots will just select that waypoint at the top of the active flight plan, verify that it looks correct on the navigation display, and then execute that routing. Providing that the aircraft's autopilot is then active in the nav mode, it will turn and follow this new routing, and after that to whatever waypoint that lies behind it according to the flight plan. Air traffic control will assume that the aircraft is following the pre-approved flight plan, so there is no need to give any further clearances unless they want to give them a shortcut, for example. And this is how air traffic control can actually handle thousands of flights per day, because the aircraft are basically navigating autonomously. Now, using that flight plan, the flight management computer will also be able to calculate when they should start to descend, for example, based on its calculated track miles, and as long as nothing changes, we pilots will basically just need to ask for descent, then manage the aircraft speed and configuration. The navigation, both laterally and vertically, will be done perfectly by the computer. But the FMC is not an intelligent computer and will only do exactly what it's told. Because of that, it is susceptible to something we pilots refer to as in, out, meaning that if we don't program it properly, it can start showing all sorts of wrong information, and that's worth keeping in mind. The aircraft was eventually cleared to climb to their cruise level of flight level 280, and around that same time, the controller also told them to continue straight towards Birmingham Airport. Now, this clearance would wipe out all of the other points that the pilots had entered into their flight plan and just replace them with a straight line towards their destination airport. In order to make that happen, the first officer would have entered the airport's ICAO identification code, KBHM, into the FMC and then put that on top of the legs page as the new active waypoint, basically telling the aircraft to just fly there. But of course, in reality, the aircraft wouldn't actually fly all the way to the airport. At some point, they would have to break away from this direct routing and intercept an instrument approach into whatever runway they would use at Birmingham. And the pilots obviously knew that. If a direct like this is entered and nothing else is done to crop the route into something more realistic, the aircraft's FMC will assume that the pilots will fly all the way until they're overhead the airport and then turn back out and fly whatever approach they had planned for, adding a lot more track miles to the route than they would actually fly. Like I said, it is a little bit stupid. So the way this is normally dealt with, at least in my airline, is that the pilot monitoring will then create a new waypoint, which is maybe 20 nautical miles short of the airport on the direct two-leg, and then connect that new waypoint with whatever approach they're expecting. This will then obviously have to be very closely monitored, that it's not actually the clearance they've been given, just an estimation, but it will give a far more accurate picture of what is likely going to happen, and therefore help the FMC to calculate a more accurate descent path. But in this case, this was not done, and neither of the pilots noticed this discrepancy. On the legs page in the FMC CDU, this issue was shown as a route discontinuity message after the KBHM point, letting the pilots know that the FMC didn't know what they wanted to do after that. Anyway, Soon after this direct routing was received, the first officer went off frequency to listen to the Birmingham Automatic Terminal Information Service, ATIS, and to write down the weather and approach information. ATIS information PAPA was active, and it said that the winds were calm, visibility 10 miles with a broken cloud layer at 1,000 feet and another one at 7,000 feet. On top of that, it also informed the pilots that the localizer for runway 18 was in use since runway 0624 was closed. The information of the runway closure apparently came as news to the pilots, with the captain just commenting, "Localizer 18, it figures." This just showed that he probably felt a little bit frustrated with having to fly a much more complicated maneuver at 5 o'clock in the morning. The first officer also chimed in and pointed out that this was typical because they were a little bit heavy and now they had to land on the much shorter runway 18. Again, this information had been available to them on the planning stage, and if they would have read it, they would have also known that the main runway was scheduled to open less than 15 minutes after their scheduled arrival time. Another thing that I want to point out here is that even though the ATIS and also some ACARS messages that the crew had received showed a nice and high cloud base of around 1,000 feet over the ground, the reality was actually a bit different. There were scores of lower clouds still present in the area, bringing the cloud base down to as low as 300 feet in places, but at the time of this observation, none of those were present exactly over the runway where the cloud base was being measured. The meteorologist who had sent out this weather had included this information in a special note, but because of some issues with the ACARS weather formatting, UPS had actually stopped including those type of notes in the weather report sent out to the aircraft. And the same actually went for the tower controller who had updated the ATIS. He could also have included those type of side notes in the ATIS if he wanted, but there were no clear instructions on exactly what type of weather that needed to be included in those type of notes, so he had just skipped it. What that all meant was that as the captain was now starting to prepare for the localizer non-precision approach, he and his colleague had likely a mental model of the weather which was dramatically better than what it actually was. And that brings us to the type of approach that they were now preparing to fly. Like I already mentioned, it was a localizer approach, and as its name suggests, it's flown using a localizer signal as the horizontal guidance. The localizer is obviously one half of an ILS approach, but without the glide slope vertical guidance, meaning that it's much more complicated to fly and gives less guidance, hence it's regarded as a non-precision approach. In a few of my previous videos, I've explained that non-precision instrument approaches who are flown without vertical guidance can be flown either as a constant descent approach, CDA, or a step-down approach, where the safest option is the CDA. A constant descent will ensure a more stabilized approach without any large changes in trim and thrust needed to level off between the different minimum altitudes, so this was what the crew were now preparing for. A CDA could be flown either with the use of vertical speed and carefully verifying distances versus calculated altitudes, or with the use of the vertical nav path option, where the aircraft would be flying a pre-programmed path down to a specific altitude over the threshold. And that's what the captain was now planning for. He started his briefing by going through a special non-precision approach checklist, which highlighted all the important steps, including which minimum descent altitude, MDA, to use, in this case 1,200 feet, and it then continued with how the approach was going to be flown, including all of the relevant points on the instrument approach charts. As the captain was briefing, the first officer was dealing with the radios and was soon handed over to the Atlanta center controller. This new controller told them to descend to flight level 240 at their own discretion, and the first officer read that back. And at the same time, a FedEx aircraft with the same call sign number, FedEx 1354, also appeared on the frequency, and when they heard this, both pilots mentioned this potential threat of ATC mixing up their call signs. This, at least to me, showed that they were both pretty switched on at this point and well into the game. The captain initiated their descent at time 0432, and when they informed the controller about this, he did indeed mix them up with the FedEx aircraft, which the two pilots had a little chuckle about. All in all, the atmosphere in the cockpit was pretty good at this point. Next, they were handed over to the Memphis Control Center, where they were soon cleared to descend further, down to 11,000 feet. This was also read back by the first officer, and after the captain had selected this new altitude in the mode control panel, he said, "They're generous today. Usually they kind of take you to 15 and then they hold you up high." And this, the captain's anticipation of being held high by ATC, will soon become important. Next, they were handed over to the Atlanta controller, who gave them the latest altimeter setting for Birmingham, 29.96 inches mercury, and once the crew had set this, the captain asked for the approach checklist. So far, this flight was flown perfectly according to UPS standard procedures, but that would soon change. At around 0440, the background sound on the cockpit voice recorder could be heard decreasing, which is a sign of the aircraft slowing down. As this was happening, the captain said, "Want to go?" which was likely said as a reminder for the first officer, since it was actually her who should have called that. She repeated it and then told the captain that she would ask for lower. What was likely going on here was that the aircraft had been descending down towards 11,000 feet according to its pre-programmed path, but as they were now getting closer, the captain started to reduce the speed to slow the descent down, but also to reduce their kinetic energy, speed, instead of their potential energy, altitude. We always tend to do it this way when we are being kept high by ATC, as it will enable us to regain the path by descending with a higher speed later once a lower altitude clearance is received. The first officer asked the controller for lower, to which he answered that they would need to switch over to the Birmingham approach controller for that. And this type of thing, it happens all the time, and it's super annoying to have to switch over to another frequency and check in when you see that you are already getting high on the approach path. But apart from anticipating it, there is not much more you can do. Anyway, as soon as the first officer checked in with the Birmingham approach, they were immediately cleared to descend to 3,000 feet, and the controller also told them that the main runway was still closed and asked if they wanted to proceed for the localizer 18. The first officer responded, "Affirm," and the controller then told them to turn right 10 degrees and to join the localizer on that heading, maintaining 3,000 feet. Now here, a couple of crucial things happened. First, remember what I said about the importance of having the flight management computer updated to make sure that the most accurate information was always there? Well, in this case, this turn to the right would have meant that the captain would have selected the heading mode on the autopilot and then turned the aircraft about 10 degrees to the right. And since the nav mode was now no longer used, this would have enabled the first officer to go into the flight management computer and select the first point on the approach as the active waypoint and then execute that. She could have also extended the centerline, which I won't go into how to do here, but both of these techniques are referred to as sequencing the waypoints and are absolutely crucial to do in order to get the correct path on the coming approach. But instead of doing that, the first officer instead started joking about how the controller's questions regarding if they wanted to proceed for the localized runway 18 was a little bit weird, since they didn't have much of a choice in the matter. The captain agreed and some general amusement ensued, but of course, if they would have actually read the NOTAM, they would have known that this question was probably asked because the main runway would open up in around 18 minutes. In any case, this jittery conversation meant that the waypoints in the FMC was never updated or sequenced, and the captain didn't notice it. This in turn meant that the FMC now thought that it had a lot more track miles than it actually had, and therefore started showing that the aircraft was well below the profile. But curiously, after the pilots had stopped laughing about the ATC's silly question, the captain now asked for gear down, and this was very early to do that. He then remarked, "And they keep you high," which was followed by a few similar remarks from the first officer. In reality, they were not particularly high at this point, so it's likely that already out here, the captain had actually started gaining a faulty situational awareness of their profile. It is possible that the fact that the vertical profile was now showing them as very low was somehow misinterpreted by the captain as being very high instead, just based on his anticipation of ATC leaving them high. In any case, they were now descending fast down toward 3,000 feet, and the captain had armed the localizer mode to capture the inbound signal. But if they would have looked closer on their navigation display and their FMC CDU, they would have seen that the painted track still continued towards the airport and that there still was a flight plan discontinuity written on the CDU, but this didn't happen. This was of course a serious omission by both of the pilots, and this giddy attitude that they were now showing could potentially be a sign of onsetting fatigue. At time 0443 and 24 seconds, the controller cleared the aircraft for approach and told them to descend to 2,500 feet to maintain until they were established on the localizer. The crew complied with that, and only a few seconds later the localizer came alive and captured, turning the aircraft towards the runway. From this point onward, they were clear to descend according to the minimum altitudes on the approach chart, but that initially didn't happen. The first charted minimum altitude was 2,300 feet to maintain until a point called Baskin, but instead of setting that, the crew just continued descending to their last cleared altitude, 2,500 feet. The captain asked the first officer to activate the approach in the FMC if she hadn't already done so, and she answered OK. You see, in the Airbus A300 you need to physically activate the approach by selecting it in the FMC in order for the path to become active, and the captain was likely hoping that this would fix the issue with the strange path that he was now seeing. A few seconds later, the first officer had completed the task, but since the FMC points still weren't sequenced, the vertical path deviation symbol remained pegged at the top, indicating that they were more than full scale or 400 feet below the path. As they descended to 3,500 feet, the captain asked for the slats to be extended, and he also exclaimed, "Unbelievable," likely referring to what he still perceived as being kept high. The first officer just agreed with a slight chuckle, and then she extended the slats for him. The captain asked for flaps 15 to be extended, which the first officer also did, as they were handed over to the new approach frequency with the same controller. And as soon as they switched the frequency over, the controller now cleared UPS flight 1354 to land runway 18, which would be the last message to the crew. The captain continued slowing the aircraft down and asking for more flaps, and at times 04, 45 and 50 seconds he called for flaps 40 and the landing checklist to be completed. Just 5 seconds after that, he also asked for the missed approach altitude of 3,800 feet to be set, and setting a new altitude was important here, because without that he would not be able to continue descending. But since the missed approach altitude was higher than their current altitude, there would now be nothing stopping them from descending all the way down to the ground. The aircraft had now leveled off at 2,500 feet, and the captain must have been expecting that the vertical path would soon become alive so that he could engage the path mode. But it was still sequenced wrong, so it just continued showing maximum fly up indications with no tendency of moving. Around here, as they were passing overhead the Baskin point, the captain must have understood that something was wrong. But instead of telling this to the first officer, he just selected vertical speed instead and now started descending. This was not what they had briefed, and he was now effectively flying an unbriefed dive and drive step down approach instead of the briefed CDA. He initially selected a descent of 700 feet per minute, which would have been quite okay, but soon increased that to 1,000 feet per minute instead, whilst also still muttering about being kept high. The first officer had now completed the landing checklist and noticed that they were flying in vertical speed and not in path as they briefed, so she said, let's see, you're in vertical speed, okay? The captain responded, "Yeah, I'm gonna do vertical speed. Yeah, he kept us high." All of these comments shows a captain who was unreasonably worried about the 200 feet above profile they actually were here, and the fact that they actually were this high, not because of ATC, but because he hadn't descended down to the appropriate minimum altitude. Those comments just doesn't really sit right with me. I think that it's way more likely that he had indeed misinterpreted the indicated vertical profile as extremely high, instead of what it actually said, extremely low. It's very hard to know why an experienced captain would make such a mistake, but it is possible that the expectation bias of being kept high, coupled with the effects of flying in the middle of the window of circadian low, could maybe be an explanation. In any case, this misconception was further shown when a few seconds later he said, "And we're like way high or higher." The first officer, who obviously didn't suffer from the same illusion, responded, "About a couple of 100 feet?" To which the captain answered, "Yeah." But he didn't reduce his descent rate. Instead, he increased it to about 1,500 feet per minute. Now, he did call out, "Alright, so at 3.3 we should be at 1380, which indicated that he was monitoring the altitude slightly here. Located at 3.3 miles distance was the point Mentour, which had a 1,380 feet restriction on it, and the aircraft would be crossing that altitude almost exactly. After that, they would be able to descend down to their minimum descent altitude of 1,200 feet, which was about 600 feet over the ground. Meanwhile, the first officer was adjusting the missed approach altitude on the mode control panel, and then, as they passed 1,530 feet, she correctly called out, "There's 1,000 feet. Instrument cross-checked, no flags," indicating that they were now 1,000 feet above the ground. The captain responded with, all right, the DA is 1,200, showing that he knew that this was the next hard altitude. But do you remember what else had been reported to be about 1,000 feet above the ground? Yeah, the cloud base. It is very likely that the crew was now fully expecting to start breaking out of the clouds and seeing the runway. But what they didn't know was that a layer of lower clouds had now moved in over the final approach, obscuring the view down to a much lower height. We cannot know this for sure, but it is likely that both pilots now started scanning out through their cockpit windows, looking for the runway through the still dense clouds. Meanwhile, the aircraft was descending with 1,500 feet per minute, a much higher rate than the highest vertical speed approved for a stabilized approach below 1,000 feet. In the UPS manuals, it was clearly stated that 1,000 feet per minute was the highest rate allowed under normal, unbriefed circumstances, and if the rate was higher than that, well then a go-around was mandatory. Anyway, next it was now up to the first officer to call out approaching minimums and minimums as they approached the 1,200 feet MDA, but those calls were never made. Instead, she said, it wouldn't happen to be actual, which can be interpreted as her referring to the actual instrument meteorological conditions they were actually inside, and that would further corroborate the idea that she was likely looking outside at this point. Now, there was an automatic call-out, both for 500 feet and minimums provided by Airbus for the A300, which, if they were installed, would have made these call-outs anyway. But UPS had chosen to disable that feature on their fleet. Now, obviously, the captain was pilot flying and therefore in charge of managing the flight path, so when he passed the MDA with no runway in sight, he should have gone around or at least leveled off, even without any call-outs, but that also didn't happen. Instead, the aircraft was now well below the MDA and the correct profile and was still descending. The captain soon called out 2 miles, which strangely indicates that he must have been monitoring at least some of his instruments here. But only 13 seconds later, the GPWS system delivered its first caution: sink rate. This was almost immediately followed by the captain mumbling, there it is, indicating that he now likely saw the runway, and what he saw must have been utterly terrifying. The aircraft was at this point at a height of only around 250 feet over the ground, over a mile away from the runway, so all 4 poppies must have been glowing bright red here, indicating just how low they were. The captain responded by immediately reducing the vertical speed to 600 feet per minute, which was obviously still too much, and he then called out, "Oh, I got the runway, 12 o'clock, to which the first officer responded, got the runway in sight, The captain now also called that he would be disconnecting the autopilot, but it was sadly too late. 2 seconds after this, the autopilot off warning could be heard, and this was almost immediately followed by the first sound of impact as the wings and the aft part of the aircraft smashed into trees and power lines in their path. This was then immediately followed by a too low terrain GPWS warning, which came late because the aircraft was so close to the airport at this point that the GPWS warning envelope had been reduced in order to avoid nuisance warnings. The captain called out, "Oh, did I hit something?" immediately followed by several, even louder impact sounds as the aircraft slammed into an earth mound about 1 mile prior to the threshold. The impact severed the aircraft into several different pieces, with the cockpit and forward part being severely compressed and the aft part almost immediately bursting into flames. In the tower, the controller hadn't received any warnings about the dire situation of the aircraft. Instead, at times 04:47 and 41 seconds, he could just see a huge fireball rising towards the low clouds at the far end of the airport. And even though he saw this, it took him over 1 minute to press the crash alarm, and that happened because the control screen had a different layout between the day shift and the night shift, and he therefore just initially couldn't even find the button. After that, there was some initial telephone confusion between all of the involved rescue teams, where the rescue leader didn't even realize that a crash had already taken place. But that initial confusion was quickly sorted out, and the fire services rapidly reached the wreckage, but there was sadly nothing they could do. Both pilots had perished from the pure impact forces. The investigation concluded that the probable cause of this accident was the pilot's continuation of an unstabilized approach and their failure to monitor their aircraft altitude, which led them to descend below the minimum descent altitude and then into terrain. The reasons this happened included all of the factors that I've already mentioned in this video, and the investigation led to several important recommendations, all of which I will include on my website, to which you can find a link to below. But the most important lessons that came out of this included more collaborative training around the area of fatigue, both between the regulators, the airlines and the pilot unions. This was to make sure that the reporting systems and preventive measures were understood by everyone involved and that their use would be strictly non-punitive. The first officer was found to have been suffering from a big sleep debt, mostly because she hadn't utilized her scheduled rest time in an efficient way, and this likely had a big effect on her performance. It is hugely important that we realize that fatigue can affect us in a very negative way, and that the responsibility for dealing with fatigue is shared between everyone, including ourselves. Other outcomes from this included stronger calls for making constant descent approaches mandatory for commercial aircraft, and more information sent out to pilots about the lower GPWS warning margins when close to an airport. Airbus was also told to improve warnings in the cockpit when the FMC is not properly set up, and to make those automatic call-outs standard and not an option. Now, if you have more questions about this or want something clarified, then please consider joining my Patreon crew. We can discuss this directly with me in our next hangout, and there's a link that you can use to sign up somewhere here on the screen or in the description below. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.